I still remember the exact feeling in my stomach that Sunday afternoon when I turned onto my quiet street in Willow Creek Meadows after a long legal symposium out of town, mind already drifting to a quiet evening with leftovers and a glass of wine, and instead saw a crowd of neighbors gathered in front of my house, some of them smirking, some of them studiously avoiding eye contact, and right there at the end of my driveway, where my car should have rolled smoothly toward my garage like it had. Every other day for 3 years stood a brand new brick wall, 4 feet high, perfectly mortared, matching my house like it had been the plans all along, except for one small detail. It completely erased my driveway from existence. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 42, a former real estate attorney who now teaches property law at Northgate University, and just to make this extra fun, I'm also the guy who literally wrote the commentary handbook for the property code in Redwood State. So when I stepped out of my car, stared at that ridiculous wall blocking my garage, and saw Monica Harrington, the HOA president of Willow Creek Meadows Homeowners Association, standing there with a clipboard and a smile that could curdle milk, I had that strange double feeling of wanting to scream and simultaneously thinking, this is so illegal, it's almost a gift. 3 years earlier, fresh off a divorce that had hollowed out most of my energy and a good chunk of my faith in people, I'd bought this modest but comfortable house in Willow Creek Meadows, tree-lined streets, trimmed lawns, the kind of place real estate brochures call peaceful community living, and I'd thrown myself into simple routines, restoring old cars in my garage, coaxing life out of small garden, grading papers at my kitchen table, trying to rebuild something like a life that belonged to me and not to court schedules and custody agreements and billable hours. And for a while it worked, right up until Monica decided my existence didn't fit her idea of perfection. It started small, the way these things always do, with a little yellow notice taped to my door 6 months after I moved in, telling me my wildflower garden out front, a bee-friendly patch of color I'd planted where my lawn used to be, was an unauthorized landscaping modification signed by Monica Harrington, complete with a note about uniform aesthetic cohesion. And because I was still new and tired and not in the mood for a war over flowers, I filled out the form, asked for permission, and got a tidy little denial explaining that non-standard flora disrupted neighborhood harmony, which was my first taste of how much pleasure she got out of using paperwork like a weapon. Then came the citations for my garbage can being visible for more than 12 hours, for my mailbox design that was somehow unapproved, even though it met postal standards, and of course for my classic 67 Mustang that I worked on in my garage, which she called an eyesore despite it barely being visible from the street. And every time I tried to appeal, I was told I had to attend the HOA meeting, conveniently scheduled during my evening property law classes, which meant I missed meeting. After meeting, while the fines kept stacking like bricks in a wall I couldn't yet see. Our first real face-to-face clash was at one of her little welcome mixers, where Monica floated around in a pastel blazer like some suburban queen bee, and she cornered me by the punch bowl, hand lingering a little too long on my arm, telling me single professional men like me were a real asset to the community and maybe we should discuss neighborhood improvements over dinner. And when I gently told her I wasn't dating, still adjusting to post-divorce life, I watched her smile stay, perfectly fixed while her eyes went cold, and she leaned in and reminded me, none too kindly, that the next HOA meeting was mandatory, and that was the moment I realized I hadn't just declined a date, I'd made an enemy. So fast forward to that wall, bright afternoon sun hitting the fresh mortar, neighbors pretending to check their phones while clearly enjoying the show, and Monica standing like she was unveiling a statue in her honor, announcing loudly that the HOA board had voted unanimously to remedy ongoing violations by replacing my non-conforming driveway configuration with an approved landscape feature, thrusting meeting minutes and a vague city permit into my hand, and beside her, nodding along. Like a loyal echo was Greg Dalton, a retired real estate agent and HOA board member, reciting section numbers from the bylaws as if they could magically override state law and my deed. I asked as calmly as I could how they thought they could build a wall across my driveway without my consent, where they expected me to park, why I'd never seen any notice of this vote, and Monica responded with that condescending tilt of her head, telling me street parking was permitted during certain hours that I could apply to build a brand new driveway on the other side of my property with proper permits, that I'd missed 14 meetings, that I had 12 violations on record, that this was corrective action, and oh, by the way, there would be an additional $5,000 assessment for the cost of the wall, but not to worry because they'd used a relative's company and gotten a discount, as if that were some kind of favor. When she finally swept away with her little entourage, satisfied with the spectacle, one neighbor stayed behind, glancing nervously up the street before introducing herself as Laura Kim, from a few houses down, an attorney in a completely different field, who pressed a card into my hand and quietly told me I wasn't the only one who had been targeted, that she'd been documenting Monica's abuses for months, and that if I wanted to compare notes, I should call her. Then she hurried off the moment. Monica's SUV appeared at the corner, leaving me alone with my brand new illegal monument and a rising sense that my life was about to get a lot more complicated. That night, I spread the HOA minutes, the permit, and my deed out on the kitchen table like a crime scene. And the more I read, the more obvious the pattern became. A permit pushed through suspiciously fast, with the work described as landscape improvement instead of a structural wall. A site plan that magically extended HOA control into the public right-of-way, where my driveway actually met the street. Minutes from a meeting I was never notified about, with 5 loyal board members rubber, stamping whatever Monica wanted, and I picked up my phone and started calling people I trusted. Laura, my old friend Ben Harper in the city planning department, and my younger sister Chloe Carter, an investigative journalist who loved nothing more than the smell of cover-up. The next morning, I met Laura Kim at a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods away. Her suggestion, because as she said with a half-joking, half-serious smile, Monica has eyes everywhere, and she slid a fat folder across the table, full of complaints, financial statements, her own legal notes, drawing a picture I'd suspected but hadn't fully seen. A picture where Monica Harrington and Greg Dalton weren't just petty tyrants with clipboards. They were running Willow Creek meadows like they're private. ATM, weaponizing fines and rules to squeeze people until they broke. She pointed out 7 families who'd mysteriously sold under pressure in the last few years. Houses bought by shell companies tied to a small development firm owned by Monica and Greg, then flipped at massive profits, a pattern of increasingly restrictive rules each time property values dipped, followed by targeted harassment toward owners of especially desirable lots. And when I mentioned my corner property, she nodded like a piece had just clicked into place, telling me my house and lot were exactly the kind of parcel they'd love to reposition for their next phase. From there, I drove to City Hall to meet Ben Harper, who pulled the permit record on his terminal and frowned before I even finished sitting down, pointing out how fast it had been approved, how it carried the signature of Alan Brewer, a building inspector and, as it happened, brother-in-law to Greg Dalton, then pulling up the original subdivision plans for Willow Creek Meadows, which clearly marked my driveway entrance in a public right-of-way outside HOA jurisdiction entirely, and Ben made me copies and told me quietly to watch my back, because what I was stepping into was bigger than one obnoxious wall. I barely made it back to my car before my phone buzzed with 3 new messages. Another HOA citation for unauthorized street parking, an extra fine for confrontational behavior toward HOA officials, and a text from an unknown number that read, "Drop it while you still can," and instead of scaring me, it just confirmed everything I'd seen in those records and made me more certain that if I didn't fight this, no one else in the neighborhood ever would. That evening, I went to see Chloe, who had already started digging by the time I knocked. She pulled up incorporation records for a development company owned by Monica and Greg, documents connecting their firm to the same LLCs that had bought those distressed properties, donation records that showed Monica sprinkling money strategically on small campaigns and local pet projects, building exactly the web of influence you'd expect from someone who treated a cul-de-sac like a kingdom. And by the time I left her apartment, my tires had been slashed in the parking lot, a note tucked under my wiper reading, "This is just the beginning," which the responding officer shrugged off as unfortunate but hard to prove, before adding that my neighborhood's name had come up in similar complaints before. If the wall had been a slap, the slashed tires were a line crossed. And in a way, they made my choices very simple. I could roll over, or I could use every bit of the law I'd spent my career studying and teaching and writing to push back. not just for me, but for everyone they'd steamrolled. So I got my car towed, took a rideshare home, installed security cameras in every legal place I could mount them, and started quietly inviting the most frustrated neighbors I knew to a gathering in Laura's backyard, behind a tall privacy fence the HOA had once approved when Monica still thought Laura could be controlled. We went around the circle that night, glass clinking softly, mosquitoes buzzing, and each story landed like another brick in the case against them. Mr. Hargrove, an elderly man fined for the inconsistent aesthetics of his wheelchair ramp. The Miller family cited repeatedly for a tiny memorial garden for their son who died in military service. Mrs. Conway, a widow buried under penalties because she'd hired the wrong landscaper instead of Monica's cousin's company. Violation after violation aimed not at protecting property values, but at punishing anyone who didn't fit the picture or who owned something they wanted. And we started outlining a plan, one that didn't just complain, but documented, appealed to higher authorities, and eventually dismantled their grip on our lives. The very next day, like clockwork, everyone who had been in Laura's yard received violation notices for unauthorized gathering, citing some obscure bylaw limiting social events. My fine doubled as a repeat offender. And instead of feeling defeated, I almost laughed because Monica had just put in writing the retaliation we needed to prove a pattern of abuse, handing me more ammo while thinking she was tightening the screws. I wrote a formal demand letter to the HOA board, the kind of letter that makes lawyers sweat, systematically citing state statutes and sections from the very property code handbook I'd authored, laying out how the wall violated access rights, how the notices failed procedural requirements, how fines were clearly retaliatory, how boundary lines had been manipulated in county filings, and I notarized it, mailed it by certified mail to every board member, and copied the state attorney general's office, the real estate department, and a couple of regulators Ben knew personally. Monica's first response wasn't on letterhead, though it was in person, with her on my doorstep the next evening, face arranged into what she probably thought looked conciliatory, telling me there had been miscommunications, offering to have the wall quietly removed if I would withdraw my complaints and sign a non-disclosure agreement forbidding me from talking to neighbors or authorities about HOA business, calling it an amicable resolution, stressing that outsiders don't understand our community standards, and my cameras recorded every second of it, the silky phrasing, the implied threat when she hinted that my academic career and community reputation might depend on harmony. When she left, empty-handed, visibly rattled that her charm offensive hadn't worked, my cameras caught something else later that night. Greg Dalton and two other men slipping into my backyard in the dark, heading straight to a corner by my shed, one of them setting something down, their movements quick and furtive, and the next morning I found it, a small marijuana plant tucked behind the tools. So obvious, it was almost insulting, and I filmed myself finding it, gloved up, carefully removing it, sealing it as evidence, because I already knew what was coming. Sure enough, right on time, Monica arrived for a property inspection with Greg, another board member, and this time a police officer in tow, talking loudly about reports of illegal substances, trying to hustle everyone toward the backyard. And I stopped them at the door and asked the officer, politely, to watch a short video, rolled the footage of Greg planting the evidence, explained my role, explained the inspection violations, and as I watched the officer's posture change, his suspicion shift from my yard to their little group, I felt the balance of power finally begin to tilt. After that inspection blew up in Monica's face, with the officer taking copies of my footage, promising an investigation, and warning her that filing false reports was a crime all by itself, events started moving fast. Chloe secured internal records showing the HOA had quietly filed altered boundary maps with the county, extending their jurisdiction into public easements and small slices of private lots without hearings, using forged homeowner approvals, and we went back to court for an emergency order to freeze their enforcement based on those fake maps. Meanwhile, Laura hosted a second, bigger gathering, and this time nearly 30 households showed up, people who had been scared silent for years, but now saw an opening, sharing documents, fines, emails, all of it weaving into a pattern so obvious, even the most cautious among them couldn't deny it anymore. And by the end of the night, we had a kind of shadow committee formed, volunteers ready to help neighbors appeal, write complaints, watch each other's backs whenever Monica tried something new. Sensing her grip slipping, Monica convened an emergency HOA board meeting, probably expecting the usual handful of residents and a lot of blank faces. But when she walked into that beige multipurpose room and found it packed wall-to-wall with homeowners, some standing in the hallway, some holding copies of my letter, her agenda suddenly didn't matter anymore. And when she tried to rush through minutes and new penalties, people pushed back, voices rising, the careful choreography of control, falling apart right in front of her podium. I stood up only after the room had already turned, after neighbors had demanded answers, after Greg himself, sensing the ship sinking, suggested that maybe we should address these allegations. And I walked to the front, laid out the altered boundary filings, the financial transfers from HOA accounts into a contingency fund that just happened to lend money to Monica and Greg's development company. The retaliation fines, the planted evidence, the threats, and even Greg couldn't pretend anymore, offering to cooperate as Monica tried to shout me down, her voice cracking as she called it all a smear campaign. The unofficial vote of no confidence that followed wasn't legally binding, but it was loud and nearly unanimous. And for the first time since I'd moved into Willow Creek Meadows, I saw fear in Monica's eyes, real fear, the kind that comes when power realizes the crowd has stopped flinching. Her retaliation was swift and ugly. An emergency executive session where she rammed through a sham vote to sell our small neighborhood park to a development company we already knew was their own subsidiary. Construction trucks rolling up at dawn to start tearing out swings and trees. But this time the community didn't hide behind blinds. They poured into the park, formed a human chain at the entrance, called the city, called the press. And when local cameras arrived and city officials confirmed that the sale and land use change were invalid without broader approval, work stopped cold. Monica, standing on the sidewalk, watching her last power move crumble in front of everyone. That night, Greg Dalton came to my house alone, looking 10 years older, asking to talk in private, admitting in a shaking voice that the whole thing had started as just a way to enforce standards and protect values, then spiraled into something bigger, uglier, describing how Monica collected favors, secrets, and leverage on officials, how the money had flowed through layered LLCs, how he'd stayed in mostly because he didn't see a way out, and finally sliding a flash drive across my table, full of emails, off-the-record notes, unreported meetings, the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about, asking for one thing in return, a shot at leniency if he told the whole truth. With Greg's drive, Chloe's reporting, Laura's legal analysis, Ben's city records, and sworn statement from dozens of neighbors, the case shifted from annoying HOA to full-blown investigation. A judge froze HOA accounts, suspended the board's authority temporarily, and authorized a forensic audit. And within weeks, charges followed: fraud, falsification of records, misappropriation of funds, conspiracy. Not just against Monica and Greg, but against a handful of city employees who'd helped grease the wheels. 6 weeks later, in what felt like a symbolic exorcism, the brick wall across my driveway came down under the swing of a rented demolition hammer. Neighbors cheering, kids drawing chalk slogans on the sidewalk, people bringing snacks and drinks, laughing in that slightly hysterical way people laugh when a long, ugly chapter finally starts to close. And watching that wall crumble into rubble felt less like a personal victory and more like a tangible reminder that this time, the bully didn't win. What surprised me even more than the legal victories was what happened after, when fear stopped being the organizing principle of our neighborhood. People who used to rush from car to front door started lingering on sidewalks, chatting over hedges, organizing garden clubs and potlucks, grilling together in that park Monica had tried to sell, turning dead common areas into shared spaces. And with Laura Kim elected as the new HOA chair under a completely rewritten charter we drafted together, term limits, open books, independent review of violations, the association slowly shifted from weapon to tool. My own life changed too, in ways I didn't see coming. All those late nights at Laura's kitchen table, drafting reforms and letters turned into shared meals, quiet conversations about more than bylaws, an easy partnership that slipped, almost without me noticing, into something gentler and deeper. And one evening on my porch, watching the sunset over a front yard full of wildflowers that nobody dared find anymore, she laughed and told me the wall had been the best thing that ever happened to Willow Creek Meadows. And for the first time, I found myself agreeing with that insane idea. In the years that followed, I testified at the state legislature about HOA reform, added a new chapter to my property code handbook about community governance and the dangers of concentrated power, spoke at conferences where people from all over the country lined up to tell me their Monica stories. And back home, our little neighborhood, once ruled by fear and grass height rulers, became something of a model: diverse yards, quirky mailboxes, accessibility ramps celebrated instead of punished, property values up, satisfaction even higher. And yet, every time I back my fully restored Mustang out of that now open driveway, white letters on the custom plate spelling out a little private joke, I still think about that original wall, about how one absurd, illegal act forced a whole community to wake up, look around, and decide they weren't going to live behind invisible walls anymore. So here's the question I keep turning over, the one I pose to my students, and honestly to you. When someone like Monica Harrington, wrapped in bylaws and titles and the illusion of authority, starts building walls around other people's lives in the name of standards and values, at what point does quietly going along become its own kind of wrongdoing? And how far would you be willing to go? Not just to tear down the wall in front of your driveway, but to rebuild something better in its place so nobody else has to learn the hard way what happens when ordinary people give their power away and forget they were always meant to own the street they live on, not the other way around.